The dirt was damp under her fingers, the earth cold and unforgiving. Old, fragile hands scraped at the soil, desperate for escape, but there was no way out. The air was thick, a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of boots against the ground. She could smell the wetness of the earth mingling with the faint scent of decay. It wasn't the kind of decay that came from nature. No. This was human-made, rotting, cruel, and vile. Her chest heaved in shallow breaths. She could feel the weight of the ground closing in on her, pressing on her frail body. Her skin, dark and weathered by time, was sticky with sweat, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her body had already begun to ache from the confined space. Her mind raced, memories flashing before her eyes in a blur. How had it come to this? The faces of the young men, boys, really, flashed in her mind. They were the ones who had done this to her, their laughter haunting her thoughts. Their cruelty, their lack of empathy, tore at her very soul. They had buried her alive. They had buried her as if she was nothing more than an animal, their hatred for her skin a weapon more powerful than any blade. She was an old woman, forgotten by many, yet there she was, fighting for her life in a hole in the ground, alone. How had it all gone so wrong? The story begins in a small, forgotten town, a place where everyone knows each other's name but not always their stories. A community that lived in the shadow of its own secrets, its history buried beneath layers of dust and time. But there was one thing no one could deny, the power of prejudice, a force that had controlled the town for generations. The old woman's name was Evelyn. She had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember. She had raised children, worked hard all her life, and had endured pain beyond most people's comprehension. But she was always kind, always forgiving. She had learned long ago that the world was filled with cruelty, but that didn't mean she had to be cruel in return. Her life had been a series of heartaches, losses, and betrayals. She had watched her children grow up, only to be taken from her by circumstances beyond her control. She had lived through the death of a husband who had once promised to stand by her side forever, only for him to turn his back on her in the end. The pain of abandonment had cut deep, leaving her to carry on alone. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that she would be left in peace in her later years. But the world had other plans for her. There had been whispers about her in the town, rumors that she had become a burden, that she didn't belong. It was the kind of gossip that no one dared to speak aloud, but it lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, like the humidity before a storm. Evelyn never understood why she was despised. It had been enough for her to simply live. But in a town that clung to the vestiges of old hatred, being different was enough to make her a target. That evening, a group of teenagers, boys who had been raised with their own prejudices and hate, had decided that they would do something about it. They had found her walking alone, as she often did, and had decided that it was time for her to pay for her mere existence. They were bored, angry at the world, and they thought it would be funny. They thought it would be fun to bury her alive. So they did. Evelyn had screamed at first, pleading for mercy, but their laughter drowned her out. They weren't interested in listening to her. They were interested in their own twisted sense of justice, their sense of superiority. So they buried her under the earth, laughing all the while, as if her pain was a game. She had been left there, alone in the dark, struggling to breathe, fighting against the weight of the earth. But she had not given up. The next moments had been agonizing for Evelyn. She could feel the cold earth seeping into her bones, the weight of the dirt pressing against her chest, suffocating her. But even in the darkness, she had not lost hope. She had always believed that there was something greater than the cruelty of the world. But this was different. Evelyn's thoughts began to blur. She thought of her children, her husband, and all the people who had once loved her. She thought of the kindness she had tried to spread throughout her life, and she wondered why it had all come to this. Was this her fate? To be discarded so easily? The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. These boys, these people, had no idea who she was, no understanding of the life she had lived. They were children of privilege, born with everything handed to them. They didn't know what it was like to fight for survival, to scrape by with nothing but hope. They didn't know the weight of hardship, of loss, of true suffering. And yet, it was her, an old woman who had lived through it all, who had become the object of their cruelty. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But the earth would not listen to her pleas. The dirt continued to fall. The silence surrounded her. And Evelyn could do nothing but fight for her life. The air was thick with tension as the boys watched her, Evelyn, slowly disappear beneath the dirt. Their laughter echoed in the air, but there was something hollow about it, as if they knew, deep down, the wrongness of what they had done. But it was too late for remorse now. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "Is she even still alive?" one of them asked, his voice breaking the silence as the last shovelfuls of dirt covered Evelyn's frail body. His name was Jack. He was tall and gangly, the one who had first suggested the idea of burying the old woman alive. "Who cares?" replied Kyle, the ringleader of the group. His face was twisted with a sneer, a look that carried all the bitterness of a life filled with entitlement and disdain for anything different from him. He was the kind of kid who believed that the world owed him something. It was in his eyes, a coldness that made the others uncomfortable, yet they followed him without question. Evelyn's cries had long stopped, but the echoes of their laughter lingered in the night air like a sickness, festering in the quiet corners of the town. As they stood there, gazing at the pile of dirt that now marked her grave, none of them spoke. They couldn't. The weight of what they had done was beginning to sink in. "I think we should leave. Now." Jack's voice had a nervous tremor to it, his words unsteady as the realization of their crime hit him. He didn't expect the guilt to be so heavy, to feel so suffocating. But Kyle only grinned, a twisted smile that made Jack's stomach turn. "Leave? Why? It's done. She's gone. There's no one to stop us now." Kyle's voice dripped with a cruel satisfaction. "Let's get out of here before anyone sees us." As the group turned to walk away, the moon cast long shadows on the ground, stretching across the quiet cemetery where the earth had just been disturbed. Evelyn, though buried beneath layers of dirt, wasn't gone. The night carried an eerie stillness as the boys disappeared into the darkness. But back at the grave, something began to shift. It started with a faint tremor beneath the earth, a slight disturbance that rippled through the soil like a whisper. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Evelyn wasn't dead. Not yet. The hours stretched on, and with each passing minute, Evelyn's strength began to return. At first, it was a flicker of awareness, her senses slowly coming back to life, her chest aching with every shallow breath she took. The smell of dirt and decay filled her nostrils, a reminder of her suffocating imprisonment. But something else was creeping in too, an anger that burned deep within her, a fire that had been smothered by years of enduring pain and abandonment. In that moment, she could feel every inch of her past, the betrayals, the rejections, the unhealed wounds from years of living as a forgotten soul in a town that only saw her for the color of her skin. But as she lay there, beneath the weight of the earth, Evelyn realized something profound. This was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, her very soul. She had fought too long, endured too much, to let this be the end. With a force that came from somewhere deep inside, Evelyn began to push against the dirt, her hands trembling as she clawed at the earth above her. Her breath came faster, the pressure of the dirt on her chest making it harder to breathe, but she did not stop. She would not stop. Her body was weak, her age had long since stolen much of her strength, but her spirit had never been more alive. She pushed harder, each movement a battle, each breath a victory. She could feel the dirt loosening, could sense the crackling of branches above her, the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. The earth groaned as though it, too, was reluctant to let her go. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the weight above her shifted. Evelyn gasped as she broke through the surface, her body trembling from the effort, but the fresh air, oh, the fresh air, was a salvation. Her body, covered in dirt and grime, lay half protruding from the ground, but she was alive. For a long moment, Evelyn could do nothing but breathe, her chest heaving as she pulled in the cool night air. The pain in her lungs felt like a rebirth. She had survived. And in that survival, something inside her clicked, something deep and powerful that she hadn't felt in years. She would not let them, those boys, those monsters, take her life from her. As the night sky stretched above her, Evelyn slowly pulled herself out of the grave, her hands and knees scraping against the earth. She was exhausted, her body battered, but she was determined. She would find her way out of this darkness, no matter the cost. She would make them see her, feel her, remember that she had once been someone. And most importantly, she would never, ever let them do this to another soul again. Evelyn's fingers scraped the ground as she crawled free, dragging herself from the earth like a creature born from the shadows. Her chest heaved with each breath, the sharp pain in her lungs a reminder of the hell she had just endured. The night sky above her seemed almost too calm for the storm that was brewing inside her, a storm of fury, of desperation, of survival. She wasn't the same woman she had been when they had buried her alive. She was something different now, something stronger. She could feel it in the pulse that raced through her veins, the fire that burned in her chest. She knew, deep down, that the boys who had done this to her were still nearby, perhaps still laughing, perhaps still basking in the thrill of their cruelty. But as the earth clung to her, she no longer cared about them. She cared only about the truth that had become clearer than ever before: they would pay. And Evelyn wasn't going to let them get away with it. The town was quiet, too quiet. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow on the streets, the alleyways, and the crumbling houses that dotted the landscape. Evelyn staggered to her feet, her knees trembling beneath her weight, but she refused to fall. She had been down there, buried in darkness, and now she would walk in the light again, on her terms. With each step, the pain in her body seemed to grow, but there was no room for weakness. Not now. Not when she was so close. The town was close by, but she didn't know how far she could make it before her legs gave way. But her mind was clear. One thought echoed in her head, steady and unyielding: justice. Evelyn's hand clenched into a fist, dirt falling from her skin as she wiped her brow. She had nothing left to lose. The years of rejection, of being pushed to the edges of society, had built up inside her like a dam waiting to break. They had tried to silence her, tried to bury her, but they would soon learn that some voices were impossible to bury. As she limped through the town's empty streets, she felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't alone. The wind seemed to whisper her name, the sound of it haunting, like a warning from the very earth she had just escaped. Evelyn could feel eyes on her, but the town remained eerily still. No one would dare to stop her, not now. She had been pushed too far. The boys, Kyle, Jack, and the others, were still on the outskirts of town, where they had gathered to drink and joke about what they had just done. They didn't realize that Evelyn had survived. They thought she was gone, that their act of cruelty had been completed without consequence. Kyle was the first to speak up, his voice slurred from the alcohol they had consumed. "Do you think we went too far?" Jack asked, his face pale. The guilt gnawed at him, eating away at his insides like a slow poison. He hadn't expected it to feel like this. The excitement of the moment had worn off quickly, replaced by the sick realization of what they had done. Too far? Are you kidding? Kyle scoffed, taking another swig from his bottle. His face twisted in contempt. She's just some old woman. She won't be missed. No one will care. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt charged, heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. He glanced around nervously, the noise of the night strangely absent, like the world had been muted in the wake of their actions. Suddenly, the air shifted. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves. The shadows seemed to deepen, creeping along the ground like something alive. Jack's heart began to race. His stomach twisted in knots. "Kyle, do you hear that?" Kyle paused, squinting into the darkness. "What are you talking about?" Before Jack could answer, a sound pierced the stillness, a low, guttural moan, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. Then they heard it again, louder this time, and it sent a chill down their spines. The sound was unmistakable. A voice. But it wasn't just any voice. It was a woman's voice, rough and cracked with pain. Evelyn's voice. "You will pay." Kyle froze, the blood draining from his face. Jack's eyes widened in fear, his body stiff with dread. He turned, looking around in every direction, as if expecting the very earth itself to swallow them whole. "Kyle, what did we do?" Jack whispered, his voice shaking. His hands trembled as he gripped his bottle tighter. Kyle didn't answer. He couldn't. The fear was too raw, too real. And then, before either of them could react, the ground began to tremble. Back in the town, Evelyn's footsteps echoed like thunder, the vibrations of her fury shaking the very foundation of the place. The darkness seemed to bend around her, wrapping itself around her like a cloak. But she wasn't afraid. She had risen from the earth once, and she would do it again. The boys, Kyle and Jack, didn't know what was coming for them. Evelyn wasn't just a woman. She was the embodiment of the pain they had inflicted, the anger of every person they had ever wronged. Her spirit was fierce, unbroken, and she would make sure they paid for their cruelty. But what they didn't know was that Evelyn wasn't the only one with a power that defied explanation. She wasn't the only one who had come back from the brink. The ground trembled once more, this time stronger, as though the entire town itself was awakening, coming to life in the wake of her fury. And with that, the horrifying truth began to dawn on Evelyn. The earth had listened. The air felt different now, thick with tension, heavy with anticipation. Evelyn's footsteps echoed in the night like the whispers of the past, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath her, as if it recognized her presence. The town, once silent and dormant, was now vibrating with a sense of something ancient awakening. She wasn't just walking. She was summoning something darker than she had ever imagined. Her mind raced, as memories of her life, of all the suffering and loss she had endured, swirled together into a potent force that made her heart burn. She had been buried, cast aside, forgotten. But now, she would not be silenced. Now, she was more than just a woman who had suffered, now, she was a reckoning. But as Evelyn drew closer to the place where the boys had gathered, something strange began to happen. The earth beneath her feet, once solid, began to shift again, groaning as though it had a life of its own. The dirt, still clinging to her body, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She could feel it in her bones, a cold, tingling sensation that crept up her spine, something that went far beyond fear. Evelyn stopped. She had reached the edge of the clearing where the boys were. In the distance, their laughter floated on the breeze, false and carefree, like a mockery of the night they had just created. But she wasn't here for them, not in the way they thought. They believed they had buried her, that they had won. They thought that their cruelty had been an act of power. They had no idea what was coming for them. The wind picked up, swirling around her, carrying with it the faint sound of her voice, the same voice they had heard moments ago. "You will pay." The boys froze, their laughter cutting off as if it had been sliced clean by the chilling words. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jack's hand trembled as he dropped his bottle, his eyes darting nervously through the trees. "Kyle, what's going on?" he whispered, his voice laced with panic. His heart was racing in his chest, and the darkness around them seemed to close in. Kyle scoffed, trying to force the fear from his voice. "It's nothing. Just the wind. Stop being so." But before he could finish, the ground beneath them shook again, more violently this time, sending them stumbling backward. The trees creaked and groaned, as if the very forest itself were coming alive, and the moon above them seemed to flicker, casting fleeting shadows that twisted and bent unnaturally. Then, a shape appeared from the shadows, Evelyn. Her form was barely visible at first, a dark silhouette against the night, but it was her presence that struck them like a physical blow. She was no longer the frail, broken woman they had buried. She stood tall, the darkness wrapping around her like a cloak, her eyes glowing with a fury that had been waiting, building, for so long. "No. No way," Kyle breathed, his face drained of color. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling, trying to comprehend the impossible. She's alive?" Jack's voice quivered with fear. This isn't right. This is beyond anything." Evelyn's eyes locked onto them, a cold, seething fire that consumed everything in its path. She took a step forward, and the air seemed to shift with her movement, thickening with the weight of ancient power. The boys froze, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. "You thought you could bury me," Evelyn said, her voice low and trembling with raw power. "You thought that by silencing me, you could erase me. But you cannot. I am not your victim. I am not your prey. I am the reckoning." The words echoed through the clearing like thunder, rattling the boys to their core. Kyle's bravado faltered, his hands shaking as he stepped back. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no words that could undo what they had done, no words that could make the terror in his chest go away. The ground beneath them trembled once more. This time, the earth was not only moving, it was awakening. A low rumble grew louder and louder until the very air vibrated with it. The boys looked down, their faces contorted with disbelief and terror. From the soil, shadows began to rise, tall, dark forms that seemed to be made of the earth itself. They were slow at first, rising like the hands of the dead, reaching up from the ground, but as they grew taller, they took on a more solid shape, like figures sculpted from the dirt. Their eyes were hollow, filled with an ancient, sorrowful rage. The boys' screams filled the night as the first shadow figure reached out toward them, its hands like twisted branches. Kyle turned and ran, but the ground itself seemed to rise against him, tripping him, pulling him back as if the earth were holding him captive. Jack was no better off. His legs gave way beneath him, and he stumbled, falling to the ground, helpless. Evelyn stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze unwavering as she watched the boys panic. She didn't move, didn't speak. The shadows were her will, her anger made flesh. She had been buried in this earth, but now the earth was hers to command. But just as the shadows began to close in on the boys, something strange happened. The ground trembled again, this time with a more familiar force, something Evelyn had not anticipated. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was a man, tall and imposing. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, one that rivaled Evelyn's own. The shadows recoiled from him, their forms shaking as if repelled by his very presence. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She knew who this was. Evelyn's gaze was fixed on the figure that had just appeared. The earth around her pulsed with energy, as if it too had recognized the man's presence. The shadows that had once answered her call now trembled in retreat, fading back into the ground as though they feared him. The man moved forward with a grace that seemed unnatural. His tall frame was cloaked in a dark, flowing garment that seemed to absorb the very light around him. His face was obscured in shadow, but his eyes glowed with an intense, golden hue, cold and calculating. It was a gaze that bore into the very soul. Evelyn's heart raced. She knew him. She had never seen him in person, but she had heard stories, whispered rumors of a force far older than the land itself. This was no ordinary man. He was a figure of legend, something far darker than anything she had ever encountered. He stopped just outside the clearing, his eyes sweeping over her and then focusing on the boys, who were now on their knees, cowering in fear. "You," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with recognition. "I thought you were just a story. A myth." The man didn't respond, but the air around him thickened with a presence so powerful it felt suffocating. The boys, once full of bravado and cruelty, now seemed like children caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Jack, trembling, turned to Kyle. Who is he?" Jack's voice cracked, barely audible, his face pale with terror. Kyle's eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time, he was speechless. He had no answers. He had no explanation for the terror he was feeling. The man's voice broke the silence, smooth and low like a rumble of thunder. "You have awoken me," he said, his voice carrying an ancient weight, like a force that had slumbered for centuries. "But you have done more than disturb the earth. You have disturbed something far greater." Evelyn's body trembled as the realization hit her. She wasn't the only one who had been disturbed. The darkness she had called upon, those shadows, those twisted figures, had been brought forth from an ancient place beneath the earth, and they were not under her control alone. This man, this figure, had been slumbering far longer than Evelyn had ever known, and now he was awake. "I thought I could control it," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and awe. "I thought I could make them see. But now—" "You did not call me," the man interrupted, his tone colder than the night itself. "I came because the earth called to me. And now, you will witness what happens when the earth demands justice." With a slow, deliberate motion, the man raised his hand, and the earth responded. The ground beneath them groaned, a sound that reverberated through the air like a warning. The shadows that had retreated from Evelyn now turned to face the boys, their hollow eyes glowing as they advanced. The boys, still frozen in terror, tried to scramble away, but the earth held them fast. The ground had risen beneath their feet, and their legs were trapped, as though the very soil had grown alive, binding them to it. "No. No, please," Kyle begged, his voice a desperate rasp. "We're sorry. We didn't know, please." But the man's gaze never faltered. His eyes remained fixed on the boys as they struggled, their pleas falling on deaf ears. Evelyn stood in the distance, watching. She could feel the power radiating from the man, a power so ancient and overwhelming that it seemed to suffocate everything around it. The shadows, once mere manifestations of her rage, were now a force unto themselves, swarming around Kyle and Jack like hungry creatures. Evelyn had wanted them to feel the pain she had felt, she had wanted justice. But as she watched the shadows close in on the boys, she began to question the path she had chosen. Had she summoned something too dark, too powerful for even her to control? The figure, still